everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at the life of Jesus using excerpts you sent in from In Search of Jesus, The Man and Christ, the Myth.
It's going to be a fascinating exploration.
Yeah, this source material brings up some really interesting questions about, did Jesus even exist?
Right.
Was he a man or a myth or somewhere in between?
Yeah, and what kind of evidence can we even use to try to figure that out, when we're dealing with someone who lived so long ago?
Exactly.
The source kind of starts by throwing us right into the deep end by pointing out that the earliest record of Jesus comes from Paul's letters.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
And those were written like decades after.
Decades after, yeah.
It's like trying to write a biography with a bunch of missing pages,
Totally.
Right.
And to add to that, Paul never even met Jesus personally.
Right.
He's more focused on the spiritual teaching and the theological implications of Christ. It's not like a biographical sketch or anything.
Right, exactly. He's not interested in sort of the day-to-day life of Jesus.
So then where do we go? We've got Paul, but where do we go for kind of more historical backing?
Well, we do have those brief mentions from Roman historians.
Yeah.
Like Tacitus and Pliny the Younger.
Right.
But they're just like tiny glimpses.
Superficial.
Yeah. So for historians, it's like, how much weight can you give to these sources? Are they even reliable? Do they even support each other? It's really like a historical detective story trying to piece together all these clues.
Oh, totally. And then the source just kind of throws this bomb at us, the Christ myth theory. I mean, could it be that Jesus was completely made up?
Well, that's what this theory argues, yeah. They say that the New Testament just doesn't give us enough historical evidence to say for sure that Jesus existed. They point to potential embellishments in the Gospels and make comparisons to other ancient myths.
I can see that.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, the source is really good at showing both sides, and it also brings up those counter-arguments.
Right.
Like, we do have multiple independent sources that back up Jesus' existence. They just may not agree on all the details.
Right. And I think that's where modern scholarship comes in.
Yeah.
It's not about blindly accepting either the Christ myth theory or the traditional narrative.
Yeah.
Historians have specific criteria they use to judge how believable a historical claim is.
Yeah.
And that's what they apply to Jesus.
Yeah, it's not a simple yes or no answer. It's this whole process of looking at the evidence, weighing different arguments, and accepting that we just may never know for sure about some things.
Yeah, and that brings us to another really interesting part of all of this, the Gospels themselves.
Yeah.
The source really highlights the differences, particularly between what are called the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John.
Right.
It's interesting.
So we've got, if I remember correctly, we've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Yeah.
And they kind of follow a similar structure, similar events.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of overlap.
And then there's John, just going his own way, much more theological.
Much more, yeah.
Focused on kind of the spiritual side of Jesus.
It's almost like if you think of the Synoptics as different people witnessing a car accident.
Okay.
They all agree broadly on what happened, but there's going to be variations in their accounts.
Little details.
And then John is like the poet.
Yeah.
Who's reflecting on the deeper meaning of that accident.
No, I love that. That's such a great way to put it. And the source brings up those really specific examples like Jesus's entry into Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Or the Last Supper.
Right.
And how John really, really highlights the divinity of Jesus.
Yes.
Especially with the I am statements.
Mm-hmm.
I am the way, the truth, and the life. Stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's that whole synoptic problem, right?
Right.
That scholars have been struggling with for who knows how long. Why are those gospels so similar but also so different?
It's like trying to figure out if they copied from each other or if there was another source they were all drawing on.
Some kind of, original source material that maybe is lost to us.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And then the source even gets into what's called textual criticism.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think is fascinating, looking at different manuscript versions to try to figure out what the most accurate wording is.
Wow. So even the Bible itself has these layers of history and interpretation.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not just this static thing that fell out of the sky.
It makes you wonder how much those layers have influenced our understanding of who Jesus was.
Totally. And on that note, the source really dives into Judas Iscariot and how he's been portrayed in such different ways.
It's so interesting to compare how he's seen in the Gospels that made it into the Bible.
Right.
Versus the Gospel of Judas, which actually paints him in a more sympathetic light.
It's almost like we're dealing with two different Judases.
It really is.
It makes you wonder, how much do we actually know about him?
Yeah.
And how much of that knowledge is shaped by who's doing the telling of the story?
It definitely raises some questions about how much we can rely on these historical accounts.
I mean, does this even challenge the whole idea of what historical truth is?
Yeah, it definitely brings up some big questions about who gets to tell history and how different perspectives can shape our understanding of the past. It's not always straightforward.
So we've covered the kind of shaky early evidence, this crazy Christ myth theory idea, and then all the different gospels and their interpretations.
Right.
But the source doesn't stop there. It also delves into some of those more controversial topics, like the Bible's stance on slavery and the roles of women.
It's important to keep in mind the historical context here. We can't apply our modern values to a text that was written in such a different time and place.
Of course. But it's interesting how the source shows how some people use certain passages to justify slavery, while others use other passages to condemn it. It's like there's this built-in tension reflecting how complex the issue was.
Yeah, and that tension also applies to the topic of women's roles. The source brings up feminist criticisms of the Bible's patriarchal structure and those limitations placed on women.
But at the same time, it doesn't ignore the significant roles that women like Mary Magdalene, Mary and Martha played in early Christianity.
Right. It's not a simple black and white picture. It's more nuanced and complex.
Yeah, it's a lot more nuanced than people sometimes make it seem.
It's about understanding the Bible in its historical context and recognizing that interpretations have evolved over time.
All right, so before we move on to part two, there's just one more thing I wanted to touch on from the source material.
Okay.
This is a bit of a sensitive topic, but the question of Jesus's mental health.
It's definitely something scholars have been debating for years.
Yeah. Some point to certain behaviors and statements by Jesus that, through a modern lens might raise questions about his mental state.
Right.
The source mentions times when even Jesus' own family and others express concern about him, and some people interpret those passages as signs of mental instability.
I think we have to be super careful here, though. Trying to diagnose someone across centuries based solely on written accounts, that can be really difficult and even potentially irresponsible.
We can't just slap a modern psychological label onto someone who lived in such a different time and culture. It's more about acknowledging those questions, understanding the complexities, and not jumping to conclusions.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the limitations of what we can know from history and not trying to force our modern understandings onto the past.
Well said. Get ready for part two, where we'll be diving even deeper into the world of early Christianity. We'll be exploring criticisms of the faith, looking at the influence of other religions, and a whole lot more.
It's going to be fascinating to see how Christianity developed and evolved in those early centuries.
So make sure you come back for that. It's going to be a great discussion.
Welcome back, everybody, to our deep dive into the world of Jesus.
So last time we were talking about kind of the early days of Christianity, and it wasn't always one big happy family, was it?
Right. It wasn't like everybody suddenly agreed on everything about Jesus.
Yeah. Like what were some of those differences in early Christianity?
Well, for example, the source mentions a group called the Docetics.
The Docetics. Okay.
And they actually believed that Jesus didn't have a physical body at all.
Whoa.
They thought his suffering on the cross was like an illusion.
That is so different from what most Christians believe today.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It really highlights just how much diversity of thought and belief existed in those early centuries.
And it wasn't just these internal disagreements, right? Christianity faced some pushback from the outside world, too.
Right, like from the Roman Empire, for example.
The source talked about how they saw Christianity as kind of a threat.
Imagine you're a Roman official.
Yeah.
And you've got this new religion popping up, challenging your traditional gods and even the authority of the emperor.
Talk about a power struggle.
Yeah, it's no wonder Christians were persecuted under emperors like Nero and Diocletian.
Right, makes sense. And it wasn't just the Romans, right? The source also mentioned how Judaism, from which Christianity emerged, wasn't exactly thrilled with this new offshoot either.
There were some major theological clashes.
Yeah.
Early Christians were often labeled as heretics by Jewish authorities.
Wow.
They argued over the nature of the Messiah, the interpretation of Jewish law.
So even from the get-go, Christianity was navigating all these internal tensions and external pressures.
It's like they were walking a tightrope.
And honestly, it seems like those challenges haven't really gone away, have they?
Not really. I mean, the source mentions critiques of Christianity continued throughout history from thinkers like Maimonides,
Yeah.
Martin Luther, Voltaire.
And even more recently, criticisms from liberalism, communism, and from within the LGBT community as well.
And it's important to note here The source itself isn't endorsing any of these criticisms.
Right.
It's just giving us a broad overview of the different debates and discussions.
Like we're getting a glimpse into this long and complicated history of how people have wrestled with Christianity.
Exactly.
And speaking of wrestling with Christianity's impact, the source also talks about this uncomfortable connection between Christianity and colonialism.
Yeah, that's definitely a sensitive and challenging topic.
It really is.
The source describes how Christianity was sometimes used to justify the actions of colonial powers.
It's a stark reminder of how religion, any religion, can be used for both good and bad.
Absolutely, and this ties into a wider conversation about Christianity's influence on Western civilization as a whole.
I mean, you can't really understand Western culture without understanding the role Christianity has played.
Right. But as with any powerful force, there have been both positive and negative consequences.
Okay, so we've talked about those external criticisms, but the source also digs into the internal debates within Christianity itself.
Yeah, like the debate over biblical inerrancy.
Inerrancy. Remind me what that is again.
It's the idea that the Bible is completely without error in everything it teaches.
Oh, right, right.
So some Christians hold a very strict view of inerrancy,
Yeah.
while others take a more nuanced approach.
So there's a whole spectrum of beliefs about how literally people interpret the Bible.
Exactly. And this leads to further debates about things like creationism versus evolution, the role of women in the church, even social justice issues.
So even within Christianity itself, there's this constant back and forth of interpretation.
Absolutely. And that process is constantly evolving, influenced by things like cultural shifts and scientific discoveries.
And then the source mentions all these different methods scholars use to analyze and interpret the Bible, like form criticism,
Right.
tradition criticism, higher criticism, lower criticism. It's a lot to take in.
It can seem overwhelming, but really they're just different lenses through which scholars try to understand the Bible.
Could you break down a few of those for us? What are they all about?
Sure. So for example, form criticism
Okay.
that looks at identifying the different literary forms in the Bible.
Like poetry and parables.
Exactly. And then understanding how those specific forms shape the meaning.
So you wouldn't interpret a poem the same way you'd interpret a historical account.
Right. And then there's tradition criticism,
Right.
which focuses on how the oral traditions behind the Bible might have evolved before being written down.
So like tracing the development of a story before it was actually put on paper.
Exactly. And then you've got higher criticism.
Higher criticism.
That's all about examining the historical context of the Bible. Who wrote the different books? When were they written? Who was the intended audience?
So basically like piecing together the who, what, when, where, why of the Bible itself.
You got it. And then lower criticism is more about the nitty-gritty details of the text itself.
Okay.
Trying to determine the most accurate wording,
Yeah.
Reconstructing the original text.
It's like scholars have this whole toolkit for unpacking the Bible.
Yeah, like they're historical detectives.
Using all these different techniques to solve a mystery.
And that brings us back to textual criticism, which we touched on earlier.
Right. The idea that the Bible was copied and recopied by hand for centuries.
Leading to those inevitable errors and variations.
It's amazing to think about how many different versions of these texts must have existed.
It is, and textual criticism is like a forensic science,
Yeah.
trying to compare different manuscripts to reconstruct the most accurate version.
So even the Bible, which seems so straightforward on the surface, has this whole hidden layer of complexity and debate.
Absolutely, and that's what makes studying the Bible so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's not just a static text, it's a living document that's been interpreted and reinterpreted throughout history.
So it's more about the ongoing conversation than finding one correct interpretation.
Exactly, and I think that's why this source material you provided is so valuable.
Yeah.
It embraces those complexities and contradictions. It presents both the traditional views and those critical perspectives.
It encourages us to really think for ourselves.
Right?
Challenge our assumptions and embrace the mystery that surrounds the Bible and Jesus.
That's a great way to put it. And I think that's a perfect segue into the next part of our deep dive,
Okay.
where we'll explore some of those more unconventional and thought-provoking interpretations of Jesus.
Right.
Are you ready to venture into uncharted territory?
Let's do it. Let's see what other perspectives we can uncover. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Jesus. And like we were saying before the break, things are about to get a little bit wild.
Right. We're going to explore some of those alternative interpretations that really challenge the traditional Christian narrative.
Yeah, like comparing Jesus to figures from other ancient religions.
Right.
The source talks about those parallels between Jesus and Osiris from Egyptian mythology or Mithras from the Roman world.
Yeah.
It's interesting how they all share that dying and rising god theme.
You're right. It
Yeah.
pops up in so many different cultures.
It makes you wonder about where these stories come from,
Yeah, it raises questions about how unique the Jesus story really is and the potential influence of these older traditions.
But the source doesn't say that Jesus was just a copycat of those myths, right?
No, it's more about presenting them as something to think about,
Yeah, like a different perspective.
to understand the broader cultural context.
Right. It's like we're zooming out to see the bigger picture. All these different ideas and beliefs floating around at the time.
Exactly. And the source also takes us on this journey through the evolution of Christian thought itself.
Yeah, how beliefs and interpretations have changed so much over the centuries.
Like how early Christians were convinced Jesus was coming back any day.
Right. The second coming?
They weren't too worried about writing everything down.
It was all about preparing for the end times.
Right. But as time went on, and that second coming didn't happen as quickly as they thought,
Yeah.
the need to preserve those teachings and stories
Yeah.
became more important.
That's what led to the Gospels, right?
Exactly. And eventually, the whole Bible as we know it today.
So the Bible itself is a product of history.
Right. It wasn't just handed down from on high.
It evolved over time, shaped by the communities that created it.
Exactly. It's a collection of texts that were written, edited, assembled, reflecting how Christian thought developed.
And that leads to another point. The source brings up the historical accuracy of the Gospels themselves.
Right. Most scholars agree they weren't written by eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
They're a blend of historical fact, theological interpretation, maybe even a bit of embellishment.
It's like they had an agenda.
Right. They wanted to spread the good news about Jesus and convert people to the faith.
They weren't writing objective history reports.
More like ancient biographies,
Yeah.
where fact and fiction were often mixed together.
To tell a good story.
Exactly. And that's where those tools of historical criticism come in,
Right.
to try to peel back those layers of interpretation and get closer to the historical core,
Like sifting for gold.
trying to find those nuggets of truth.
And then there's that whole question of Jesus's mental health.
Yes, a sensitive and controversial topic.
Not your typical Sunday school discussion.
But the source mentions those passages where people question Jesus's behavior,
Right.
and some interpret that as evidence of mental instability.
I can see how that would be a touchy subject.
But I think it's important to acknowledge these questions even if they make us uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's all part of that critical examination.
Trying to understand who Jesus really was.
To separate the man from the myth.
Exactly. And it might not be a simple answer.
Like peeling back layers of an onion.
We might not find a clear-cut answer at the center.
So this source material has really taken us on a journey, hasn't it?
It really has.
We've explored the historical evidence, the mythical interpretations, the criticisms, the defenses, those unconventional perspectives.
It's been a whirlwind of information.
But I feel like I've come away with a much deeper understanding of Jesus.
And the impact he's had.
But more importantly, it's made me want to keep exploring and asking questions.
That's the whole point.
The search for Jesus isn't about finding all the answers.
It's about engaging with those questions, embracing the complexity, keeping the conversation going.
It's a journey that's been going on for centuries.
And it's going to continue for many more.
So to everyone listening, we encourage you to continue your own exploration of Jesus.
Whether you see him as a man, a myth, a historical figure, a spiritual icon.
There's a whole world of resources out there.
Books, articles, documentaries, podcasts.
Don't be afraid to dive in.
And remember, there's no right or wrong way to approach this.
Find what resonates with you. Ask the questions that matter to you.
And seek your own understanding.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope you enjoyed it.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep seeking.